Hello, I am the plant-based pâtissier, and today we will be making this beautiful vegan cherry frangipane tart. One thing I will note is I will be measuring out all of the ingredients used in this recipe, and I am doing this for two reasons. One being measuring by weight is just a bit more accurate than using measuring cups, and another being I am actually making this in a bigger tart pan than the recipe calls for. The original recipe calls for an 11-inch tart pan, and mine is a 12.5-inch tart pan. This is much larger, though I was taking this tart to an event. So there was going to be a lot of people eating it, and I figured I would rather have more tart than use my 9-inch tart pan and have less tart. Ultimately, that was a good decision, as it was rather popular. Resizing recipes for different sized pans is not an easy task. It does require you to do some manual math most of the time. I could not find a chart that very easily converted from one tart pan to another tart pan, so I just did the math myself. I determined that from 11 to 12.5 was going to be a 13% increase of ingredients, so I multiplied all of my current ingredients by 1.13. As you can see, measuring by weight is pretty easy. I'm just putting my food processor on the scale and just pouring in my flour and sugar until it gets the amount I want. I had to scoop some of the sugar out because I poured a bit too much at first, but that's not a very difficult fix. We will have to be doing the same for our butter. This recipe recommended I specifically use Earth Balance vegan butter. Typically, I use Country Crock plant butter, but Earth Balance, I actually do agree, tends to work better in something like a tart crust. So that's what we're using. It is important to note that the butter here is cold. When a recipe calls for a specific butter temperature, it's important to stick with that. You're going to want the cold butter because of the way it will incorporate itself into the crust. You don't want to mix it completely in there. We want to create kind of some flakiness, some layers to it. That's why the butter is cold. For the filling later, we are going to use soft butter. I currently have more sticks of butter sitting out until I have to make the filling. I don't recommend softening butter in the microwave. It can often get too hot and melty, which is not good either. We also are cutting the butter into cubes. Yes, I did this after I measured it. Don't ask why. Anyways, the reason we want to cut the butter into cubes is also because of those layers I was talking about. We want it to be spread throughout the dough in these tiny layers. Cubing them does help create those layers and kind of separates them throughout the food processor. When I put them in later, you'll see I kind of scatter them about rather than put them all in one spot. To give the crust its nice shaggy finish, we will need some water. As it so turns out, water is difficult to measure. Much like the butter, though, the temperature of the water is also important. You may notice I poured it from my Brita filter, which was in my refrigerator. The recipe called for cold water. This is also to help keep the butter cold. Temperature is very important, even before things go into the oven. And yes, I was struggling quite a bit with getting the proper weight of the water here. The only things in our food processor currently are the flour and the sugar, which we will be mixing. You may have also noticed I have a cat in the background. Her name is Focaccia, if you wanted to know that. I also have a brown tabby cat named Rexy, although he makes less appearances in my kitchen. Focaccia just likes to watch me bake. I will say I did add a little bit of salt to the dough off camera that was not seen, and I was putting in the vanilla extract in that spoon. I know my hand was blocking it. I'm working on getting the camera angles a bit better. We are also now adding our little cubes of butter. As you'll see, I'm just kind of dropping them in dispersed out throughout the dough in order to help us get those nice, beautiful layers. It's not quite as precise or obvious as something like a puff pastry. You can see the layers of the dough. but it will provide a lot of beautiful, buttery flakiness throughout the crust. Just had to finish my thought after I finished up with the food processor. Now we are adding our dough to the bowl, and it doesn't look too much like a beautiful tart dough. It is way too crumbly to form anything resembling a tart. Whoops, my blades fell off my food processor. I had a little brain fart and forgot to take them off, but oh well, it doesn't really matter that much. It just looks a bit silly on camera. Anyways, we are adding the water to this crumbly dough, and we're just going to gently work that in. I'm not kneading it or anything like I would a bread, I'm just making sure the water fully combines with our dough in order to form the crust. You really don't want to overwork it and mix the butter around in there too much. You'll see it's forming a pretty sticky, nice dough. That's exactly what we want because, well, we want it to stick to itself. If it doesn't stick to itself when we roll it out, we're going to have a really difficult time getting it into the tart pan and making a proper tart crust. One thing I would like to point out is that I am touching the dough with my hands, and I did also touch some butter with my hands earlier to get it off the knife. I can assure you that my hands are clean. I wash my hands more often than I wash anything when I'm baking. I wash them in between touching ingredients, I wash them in between touching tools, or the counter, or anything that is not the current ingredient I am working with. Hand hygiene is very important. And there you hear me washing my hands again. Now, let's take our dough and put it on this parchment paper on my counter. I prefer rolling things like dough on parchment paper for two reasons. One, it keeps a layer between my counter and the dough. This is so I can assure the dough is clean. I do clean my counters before I bake, but, well, sometimes while I'm baking, there's some messes, and I just have to spot clean them and keep going, and I would rather just keep the dough as clean as I can. The second and slightly more selfish reason is because I do not enjoy cleaning my counters and would rather not have a mess of dough on the counters, so, well, there we go. Parchment paper means my counters are clean. Now we flour up our rolling pin and we roll this out. Yeah, I got a little bit of flour on the dough. That's gonna be just fine. It really won't affect the flour content of the final product too much. When I'm rolling out a dough, I like to change directions pretty frequently. I think it just kind of helps me even it out and get a better angle. So you will be seeing a bit of my elbow tattoos over this footage. Hope you like them. I think they're pretty cool. Now, we're going to be rolling this to about 1/8 of an inch thick. I am not busting out a ruler to measure this, we're just approximating it, and that is just fine for something like a tart crust. If it's too thick, it could be underbaked, or the ratio is just going to taste kind of off. It's a little too crusty. However, if you do want to actually measure it, you can get rubber band type things to put around your rolling pin, and the thickness of the rubber band correlates to different thicknesses you may roll something out to, including 1/8 of an inch. I prefer just going on vibes. We've placed our rolled out tart crust over our pan, and as you can see, it does not look good, so I'm going to spend this time prettying it up a bit. You want to make sure that the whole inside of the pan is covered in an approximately even layer. So, in areas where it's too thick or hanging over the edge, we just take those off, and we put those in areas that are too thin or uncovered by crust. I can kind of tell by touch which areas need a bit more crust on them. Sometimes you can even kind of see part of the tart pan through the dough if it's too thin. So I just fortify those areas. You don't want your crust to be too weak. One thing I really love about this type of tart pan is it has a bottom that pops up from the sides. This is fantastic. It means that you can very easily just pop the tart out, it won't stick at all. Seriously, I do not grease these types of tart pans, and I don't recommend you get any other type of tart pan besides one with a removable bottom. If you don't have one and you have a regular tart pan without a removable bottom, this may change your life. I actually thrifted this at a thrift store down the street for about $1. Some people are very intimidated by the idea of making a tart crust or a pie crust, but I honestly find it really satisfying, especially the part where you're just making sure everything is nice and even. It's kind of meditative. This is honestly one of my favorite things to make. Is just a tart crust or a pie crust. You may also be wondering what the difference between a tart and a pie is. And, well, the answer is complicated, and there is a lot of arguing on the internet about this very topic. Some people insist that tarts don't have a side crust. I don't necessarily agree, but I guess some may call this a cherry frangipane pie. I really define a tart as not having a top crust, like many pies do. A lot of pies will either have a lattice or a crust on top enclosing the filling, where a tart is always open. This also means that cheesecake is technically a tart. Now that we've pressed our tart crust into our pan, we're going to just let it chill in the refrigerator for an hour. We will also preheat our oven in preparation for baking our tart crust. We're going to bake it without filling at first. This is called blind baking. Into the oven for the very first time it goes, and now we can start working on our filling. We are going to be using my kitchen scale again because I had to make more crust, so naturally I'll also have to make more filling to fill that same volume of crust. So we tear our scale and we carefully measure out our all purpose flour. Next, we're actually going to add another flour. This time it's almond flour. A frangipane is a characteristically almondy filling, so naturally almond flour makes sense here. I don't actually use almond flour for a ton of things. It's mostly a frangipane and macarons, which are a whole other story. One of my pantry staples is going in next, and that is maple syrup. It's a wonderful replacement for honey in baking, but it's also absolutely delicious on its own. I love using maple syrup anyways. To replace the niche that eggs are going to be filling in this, we're going to be using a coconut yogurt. Now, it's yogurt made of coconuts, not necessarily coconut flavored yogurt, though it does taste a bit like coconut. This flavor doesn't really come through in the tart, it's just surprisingly neutral. I didn't taste any coconut notes at all, so don't be too scared of it. Next, we're adding some arrowroot powder, and then we're going to be adding some baking powder, and some vanilla extract and almond extract. The almond extract, of course, is to get more of that nice almondy flavor throughout the frangipane. I actually think it's okay to up almond extract and vanilla extract just a tiny bit to get more flavor. I do sometimes do this, and people always tend to be impressed by it. Extracts usually don't add enough moisture to be critical, so you can do a teeny more or a teeny less depending on your needs. And now it's time for our soft butter. This butter has to be soft because we want it to mix in. We want to make a nice, creamy, almondy type of situation. If our butter were cold like it was in the crust, that just wouldn't work at all. We would have a frangipane with very awkward spots of grease. Due to me increasing the recipe, I can't use a nice even whole stick of vegan butter. So, yes, I have to just put one whole stick of soft butter in and take some more from a different stick, just kind of shaving it off where I can. This is fine. I can still use that half shaven off piece of stick of vegan butter for something else. I'll just have to be careful in measuring it next time, and I'll probably also do that by weight just to be sure. You can see this, and I forgot to film it, but I also added some zest from a lemon in there. It just gives it a really lovely brightness. After we have all of our ingredients combined, we just mix it all together. The butter is soft, but still a bit hard to mix, but you'll see in the end I do eventually get a relatively smooth consistency. I do the rest of the mixing off camera, but next you will see me pour this into the actual tart that has since been cooling on my counter. However, before we can actually pour it into the tart, we're missing a very crucial component for a cherry frangipane: the cherries. I picked up some fresh cherries at Whole Foods, and next we're just gonna be cutting those up, and then we're gonna add it to the tart. I'm showing you this at 4x speed because I figured you probably don't want to watch me cut cherries for 3 minutes, though you've watched the rest of this video, so maybe you're into that. Either way, to cut the cherries, we simply first remove the stem, and then cut it down the middle with a knife, give it a little twist, and then I just take the pit out using my hands. Some pits are harder to remove than others, which can be a bit of a pain, but usually it's not a big deal and they look relatively okay. They do make devices to pit cherries for you. There's a couple life hacks using things like straws, but I just prefer to use my hands. I was actually pretty unsure how many exact cherries I would need. I just kind of guessed, and I was having fun cutting them anyways, so I didn't really mind. I also figured if I cut too many, well, I'll just eat them. And now it's time for another part of this recipe I find so incredibly satisfying: pouring in the frangipane and evening it out. I just smooth it out with the back of my favorite blue silicone spoon. You'll see my favorite blue silicone spoon make appearances in my videos quite often. The frangipane may look a little thick, but as you can see, it actually spreads out quite beautifully, and it is very, very smooth to work with. There's something just so satisfying about the way this frangipane spreads out that I decided to just leave the whole footage there. Although this is at 2x speed because otherwise it would take quite a while. Plus, we still have to get to the cherries, so I wanted to keep it in there, but just a little faster, and I don't think it's too disruptive to look at. Anyways, I do hope you enjoy this section. I really actually enjoyed it, and I'm enjoying watching this while I'm editing this right now. And now we just put the cherries in. I place them cut side up and just do a little circle pattern on the outside, going in until I cover the whole thing in cherries and it looks pretty. Much like spreading the frangipane, I also decided to just leave in the footage of me placing all of the cherries by hand. This is because, one, I found it quite satisfying as well, and two, I think it would feel a bit awkward with too many cuts and teleporting cherries just flying all over the place, so we left it in. It can be easy to see a lot of imperfections in things like your spacing, or the size of the cherries, or even the ways they're cut. These are things I try not to focus on too much. I don't necessarily strive for perfection in the visual aesthetics area. It's nice and it looks pretty, but I think sometimes a bit of craftiness can kind of give these things its charm. And after it's baked in the oven and all is done, no one is going to notice that some cherries are not quite evenly spaced. They will just see a beautiful frangipane tart in front of them that they want to devour. And that is exactly what happened when I brought this to my beat up with my friends. I guess life can also be a lot like that. We focus so much on our imperfections that we forget others don't see us that way. Maybe that's a little deep and not quite relevant to baking, but I do think we are our own worst critics in everything. Anyways, back to actual baking. I'm just sprinkling some slivered almonds on top for some more extra almondy goodness. And into the oven we go for the final time. And there you have it. Together we have made a cherry frangipane tart. Just look at how beautiful this is. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you feel inspired to maybe give this recipe a try.